So the V70 has been making a few squeaking and rattling noises while running, and being on 332,000 miles, it's getting very close to where we see alternator failure on the Euro 3 D5s. It's one of the only things that actually concerns me about this engine. It's much more common on the later ones for the auxiliary belt tensioner to fail and for the auxiliary belt to get fed into the timing belt and obviously completely wreck the engine. Now I'm at the point where it was running so bad that I can't even record a new video of it running, but I do have a few videos of it just before I decided that's it, I'm not going to continue running it. I'd already ordered an auxiliary belt tensioner, so I actually have that to hand. I got a quote for the alternator. They're about £220 exchange, so I haven't actually ordered one of them yet. But the tensioner pulley is the only one that I can see slight playing. I can move it from side to side a little bit. So it looks like that's what I'm going to be replacing right away. For auxiliary belt removal, if you want a full video, you'll need to look at my other ones. What we've got is a T60 Torx to take the tension off the belt, and then the belt can be just pulled off one of the pulleys. I've removed the cover for the ECU box, which gives you a bit more room down here, and I've also lifted the power steering fluid reservoir out of position. The auxiliary belt isn't old. I only replaced it, let's say 30k miles ago when I did the timing belt. It does appear that it may have been wearing slightly on one side, which would be the pulleys pushing it out of line and against one of the pulleys, or the crank pulley with a side on it, such as the power steering pump. Now, just to be even more sure that it's definitely something running on the auxiliary, now with the auxiliary belt removed, we can start the car. And we can hear that the noises in the previous videos are gone. So it's actually the next day. I left the auxiliary belt removed and drove home, just a few miles. I've got a really good battery on this, so do manage, but driving without power steering is not much fun. This is the new genuine Volvo tensioner. Take note of whether yours has the idle pulley as well, as there seems to be two different types of auxiliary belt tensioner. I think it's the later one that doesn't have an idle. I'm assuming so because I've got a 2005 here as well. Now, I found play in the auxiliary tensioner pulleys, which looks like we're going to be able to get rid of that. But what I've also found is the freewheeling clutch on the alternator doesn't appear to be working. So if you spin from side to side, you should get a moment where the clutch disengages, but it isn't doing it on this car. So I thought I'd check on the XC90 I have here, and what happens when I do it on the XC90 is when I spin it anti-clockwise quickly and then stop the pulley, there's a moment where the motor is still spinning, but I have the pulley still. I don't know if that's a good explanation or not, but so you can sort of spin it and stop, but the fins that you can see there still spin for a split second after the pulley stops. So if I'm understanding this correctly, that means that this alternator is stuck on, so it's unable to freewheel, which would explain the wagging in the belt. So for now, as the alternator is on order, I'm going to fit the auxiliary belt tensioner, the new tensioner, which it looks like you can actually remove without removing the alternator, which is what I was expecting. I was expecting that you would have to remove power steering, alternator and get down to it. I thought it would be bolted to the block that way, but it seems that it's just got 2 bolts blocking it to the side of the engine. So for the time being, we'll get that off. What I've done is I've locked the tensioner fully off, which you have to do to uncover this top bolt here. The bolt is behind the pulley, and I've used a 4mm drill bit. So you'll pull the tension off the tensioner clockwise, and at the same time insert a 4mm pin. So clockwise as far as you can, it'll hit this stop here, then insert the pin. And here's a better view of how the pulley would cover the hole if the tension wasn't on it. It's actually looking like the fixing at the bottom of this tensioner is different to the one on my car. I've checked mine and I've checked this XC90 next to me as well, and they're both the same. They don't have this fixing at the bottom. So that fixing on the other one should be about there. So I don't know if the idle pulley has a bolt going all the way through to the block, and this tensioner that I've got is a newer one. I'm gonna have to get the old tensioner off to find out. So I've loosened this bolt at the front here, and as far as I can tell, there must be a bolt under the plastic cover going through into the block, all the way through the tensioner, or the idle pulley, into the block. So you can pop these plastic covers off. So that idle pulley has a 13mm head. Does appear to be a long a long bolt. It's definitely not looking the same as this. So this is how mine appears to be held on. Another 10mm bolt here. So two 10mm bolts. I don't know where the top one is. So that one there. And one there, which would be somewhere here behind the idle pulley. So this can't possibly be right for whatever reason. I've ordered this directly from Volvo, but yeah. So definitely that lower 10mm holding this on, and then I've just got the one at the top. Seems the locking pins, that's what happened. Yeah, locking pins either snapped, drill bit. So locking pin back in, removing the top bolt. Actually damage here. And what's happened there? Anyway, that's removing the tensioner on this car at least. Similar job on the other ones, except you don't need to remove the pulleys. So I've no idea what engine this one's for. It'll be for a D5 of course, but I don't know what generation. So I spoke to Volvo. I can't get the correct part until tomorrow, which means driving back to Hull, which is a 60-mile round trip. Apparently this would be for the later models, so I'm thinking probably Euro 4. Mine's one of the Euro 3 engined 2004, 2005 models, so it seems that that's what's happened. So I'm gonna have to, I've left the tensioner off, and I'm gonna obviously leave the belt off, and now I'm gonna have to go pick up the alternator. So I'll be able to replace the alternator today. I'm gonna have to wait till tomorrow to do the tensioner and find a vehicle to drive to Hull in. You'd be surprised how far you can get with a good battery, even without the auxiliary belt connected. In fact, right now I've got no error codes. They will come on shortly. The only thing that's impossible is the power steering, the lack of power steering. After about half a mile of driving, this is the error message that you'll get. But as long as your battery is well charged, you can carry on driving. The thing that's probably using the most power are the headlights, which are always on. Made it back with the new alternator. I'm just checking that the back of it looks the same as the original one. Last thing I want now is to have another incorrect part. Made it back just before the battery almost wouldn't start the car. So that's now on charge. You'll obviously need to disconnect the battery now to remove the wiring for the alternator. I can't show you how to because my covers are all missing. I probably have a video previously that does cover disconnecting the battery and removing the battery. So it looks like we need to remove the power steering pump. We may be able to leave the pipes attached. I'm hoping we'll be able to. And yeah, so we'll see. So I'll start removing this. I'm going to try and do this without removing the radiator top hose. So I've looked at the new alternator and seen where the fixings are. So we've got one fixing that is going into the side of the engine, and then we've got two fixings at the bottom which are also holding the aircon pump, which will mean that we'll need to loosen, at the very least loosen, all four aircon bolts and remove the top two in order to pull the alternator out. So I'm removing this charge pipe here, this pipe that goes from the intercooler to the plastic pipe that's under the engine. So I've loosened the Jubilee clips on these. I'm undoing this bracket that goes to the back of the power steering pump. There are two 12mm and I've got 10mm here, but it appears the clamp has bent down over it. So what I'm going to do is just remove these bolts at the back and hopefully just flip it over. I'm just putting the bolts back in the hose so that I don't lose them. We've got four bolts. 3 bolts actually holding the power steering pump on, and one of them appears to just do this bracket. So all 3 of those bolts are the same. So obviously I've had to pull this extra bracket through, but I think that this will be far enough out of the way to still be able to get the alternator out this way anyway. So we should still have room even round the top hose and the power steering pipes. Wiring to the alternator, just got this spade connector here and 13mm nut for the battery lead to make sure that your battery is disconnected prior to doing this. Put the nut with the new one just in case it doesn't have one on. I think it did have one on. So for the aircon pump, what I'll do is I'll loosen the lower bolts first and then remove the top ones. On this Euro 3, the bolts are 12mm, and on the Euro 4, they'll be 10mm. And I know this because I swapped this aircon pump from a Euro 4 engine. If you loosen the bolts fully on the aircon pump, it will be pretty loose, which I think will give us enough room to squeeze the alternator out once we remove the bolt on the side of the engine. So it looks like it's this bolt here that's covered with grime. Another 12mm. It wasn't even particularly tight. Longer bolt than I thought. So yeah, the alternator is loose. So just as I thought, there is enough room to do this without removing the top hose and the power steering pipes. So that's pretty good. So I think reversal of removal is pretty apt when replacing this alternator. There isn't really anything to consider. It came out quite easily. I'm surprised. It's a job that I have been putting off for quite a while, but now it has failed. I've had no choice. It does look like my power steering pump is leaking, and it doesn't, it could be coming from the hose, but I'm not 100%. I don't know if this would cause alternator failure, but as you can see, it's obviously been leaking onto the alternator and making quite a mess. So I shall replace that, or at least check this hose, try and stop it leaking. On this brand new alternator, what I'm hoping you'll be able to pick up here and see on the video is when I turn and stop the pulley, there is a split second where the fins that you can see inside carry on spinning. And this is what disconnects the drive from the alternator and stops the extra strain on the belt as it changes speed. I'm just cleaning up the mess from the power steering fluid leak best I can before I put the alternator back on, because obviously you can't get behind that spot once the alternator is refitted. Slotting the new alternator down into position behind the aircon pump. We'll stick the top bolt in first. Should be easiest to hold it in position. If you are wanting to torque the bolts, all the fixings for the alternator and the aircon pump are just 24 Newton meters. It's a good job I kept the nut, because the new one didn't actually come with one. So alternator all done, ready to go. Now just to wait for the new tensioner, which I'll collect from Volvo in the morning. Should be nice and easy to fit, and then all done. So been to Hull today, picked up the correct tensioner. No one quite knows why I was given the wrong tensioner in the first place, but here's the correct kit. So pulley, idle pulley not attached, bolt for the idle pulley, cover for the idle pulley. We don't get new bolts, so we need to use the original bolts. As you've seen from removal, it's not particularly difficult to refit it. These mounting bolts, the torque rating for them is only 35 Newton meters, so they don't need to be overly tight. And make sure that the surface behind the tensioner is clean. I did actually clean mine while I had the alternator off anyway. So it's about 35 Newton meters on the tensioner itself. So the idle pulley, I don't have a torque requirement for it. I've read online that it's about 20, so I'll probably do about 25. I've noticed that it's actually iron A, which is quite funny because the tensioner that was on it was iron A, but I've now put a Volvo tensioner on it and it has iron A bearings. It would have been nice to actually see SKF bearings, that would have been more appropriate. The torque wrench doesn't even go down to 20, the lowest on it is 30. So I'm just not going to over tighten it. Obviously it's only holding on to the bearing. Should be enough really. I don't know why that cap sticks out further than the other one. Not even proper. So it is good practice before you take the belt off to draw a diagram of the route, but on the Volvos it's off the crank pulley and it sort of zigzags, so it's down around the idle, over the tensioner, around the auxiliary belt, around the alternator, around the power steering pump and straight down to the aircon pump. And you'll need to tuck it through the gap over the crank pulley. So much easier with that locking pin in position. So the belt's in the routed correctly, it's sat on all the pulleys correctly. Now we can take the locking pin out. Really could do with something more appropriate for releasing the tension on the tensioner, as this has slipped off a few times, but that's what I've been having to do. Can't get a big breaker in there with an adapter. I'm going to keep that. It's really convenient for getting the belts on, it's a lot easier. Let's do a final check that the belt's correctly placed on all the pulleys. A bit far over on this idle pulley, but that will straighten up as long as it's on the crank pulley correctly. And I would check top and bottom on the crank pulley. The reason that I stopped is I wasn't happy with the way that the belt was moving on the idle pulley at the bottom. It seemed to be moving from side to side like this. It seemed to run on the tensioner pulley fine. The only slight issue that I found is the power steering pulley. But even though it has sideways movement in it, I don't think it would be what's causing the belt to move down here, because we've got the alternator in between. So I've had the idle pulley off. I've just checked that it's definitely sat right. And I'm just going to try again. Idea what the issue was before, but refitted and it's running fine now. A little bit of chirping on the bell, might be just the bell, but I'm going to keep an eye on that power steering pulley and probably change the power steering pump in the near future. Sorry it's been a bit of a long one, but you know, the jobs are real and I do have trouble carrying them out. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.